The nature of a neurodivergent brain is that it was just never meant to function between 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. That's why we always struggled so much at school. That's why we're always diagnosed as being difficult learners. Sometimes our brains are on, sometimes our brains are off. We're not in charge of that. Well, you're a leader and you're neurodivergent. So you need to take the action so you can positively affect other neurodivergent employees. That sounds a bit backwards.
Hello and welcome to the Creative Business Podcast, a podcast exploring the intersection between creativity and commerce. I'm your host, Brad Eather, a marketing communications consultant supporting businesses from cybersecurity to systems integrators build sustainable marketing functions. Whenever neurodiversity in the workplace comes up, the word accommodation gets thrown around. But what are we actually accommodating? While many businesses love to claim they value diverse thinking, most remain rigidly structured around neurotypical norms. So how do we stop treating accommodation like an inconvenience and start treating cognitive diversity as a strategic business advantage? My next guest climbed to the very top of a corporate ladder as a notable chief technology officer, all while unknowingly living with a complex neurodivergence. Having received a late-in-life dual diagnosis of autism and ADHD, he now argues that building a flexible environment for non-linear thinkers both improves business standards overall and empowers the entire workforce. Please welcome to the show, Myke Island.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for having me on board.
We're meeting at a crossroads for you, so I'm looking forward to the chat. Myke, I want to kick things off by asking you a bit of a big question, but what do you think the biggest misconception business leaders get wrong about neurodiversity?
Brad, I think it's probably a combination of things. I think for me, the thing that tends to stand out is, as you mentioned earlier, we have this concept of accommodation, accommodating the neurodiverse, like as if there's, one pool of people here that are the normals, and then there's a pool over to the side that the neurodiverse people get to swim in. And every now and then we can come and visit like the main pool, but we've got to go back to the other pool because that's where we pee, and, they don't want that in the big corporate pool. So I think there's this approach of still treating neurodiversity as being an alternative way of thinking and not a mainstream way of thinking. And in my opinion, I think that businesses are losing a little bit of the added advantage that you can have by building around some neurodiverse frameworks. There's stats that keep coming out that talk about productivity in Australia, right? We talk about productivity decline. And I can't help but think that there's got to be some correlation between this productivity decline or measured productivity decline and the rapid onset of neurodiverse thinking, right? There's more neurodiverse people entering the market every day. And I don't know whether we're measuring productivity the right way anymore. I think maybe it might be time to sort of reassess what productivity looks like within business framework and maybe realign some of that to some neurodivergent ways of thinking.
For people that don't know, Myke, you've come from the world of audio-visual integration, a lot of which is to do with integrating new technologies into the workplace, and sort of aligned with what you were just saying. As technology becomes more and more encroached into the workplace, those norms around what is productivity are changing. Like, just from that perspective of the user interfacing with technologies in a workplace, how does that sit with you? How do you align those two types of thinking?
Yeah, I was always a big predominant user experience guy, right? User experience for me was always the key aspect of technology, particularly if you're measuring technology on its adoption rate, right? If people are actually using it. Because we often, in the systems integration world, we would get excited about the size of a deal, the scope of a deal, how much money it's worth, and what it's going to look like in a case study, without all that much effort on what's it going to be like for the user, both now and down the track. And who is the user? This is the other question that comes up. Because quite often when you're doing systems integration work, the user is the buying manager or the project manager within the business. It's not always the end user. And we would often find that we'd be so far removed from the end user that there might be like a building firm in between us and a consultant, and then there's a consultant between a builder and a customer. And so being able to design user experience for a wider range of users was always a challenge because you never get to meet the users. The consultants might, they might spend some time with a user group, with a focus group or something. But I think no matter what happens, all of that information is disseminated down into a very typical scope of works that is often built around a neurotypical framework. And we're not considering things like, visual interpretation or audible interpretation of how neurodivergent people are going to act around this technology. One of the things that I always use as an example is closed captions, right? Closed captions on meetings, particularly Skype meetings and Teams meetings and things. For a neurodivergent person to sit through a 40-minute meeting and have to pay audible attention to that meeting whilst processing everything that's going on in the meeting can be pretty hard. Something as simple as just enforcing closed captions on every meeting that you have now all of a sudden makes things easier on neurodivergent people, but it actually makes it easier on your neurotypical people as well. Probably just haven't realized that until you've turned closed captions on. So small little things like that, I think we can spend a bit more time trying to understand what is the entire span of the user base and how are we making sure that the net we cast encapsulates all of those users, not just the people that are attending the meetings in the design phase.
The discussion so far has been talking about the lens that you have from a chief technology officer perspective. You're currently not working as a chief technology officer, but I want to get back into the neurodivergence and leadership sort of discussion here. And I want to ask you what you think your childhood self would think about the guy who became a CTO.
It's funny. It's a good question because I've been doing a lot of work over the past, 6 to 12 months in conversing with that 7-year-old version of myself because he needs a bit of love. And I've not necessarily been very kind to that kid in the last couple of decades. I think my 7-year-old self, if they could see me now, would be somewhat overwhelmed with where things went. A lot of it would be very much unexpected. I think if I take the feedback that I was given as an undiagnosed neurodivergent at school, class clown, always distracted, always distracts others, can't concentrate, would be great if he could apply himself. So I think some of that 7-year-old kid would be looking at me and being like, wow, how did you manage to do all that considering all this negative feedback we get all the time? And then I think some of that kid would probably be like, well, there you go. You weren't all right, teachers. Like it wasn't always going to turn out that this kid was going to be bad and unsuccessful. But I feel like probably what I did early on, early 20s, my approach to the world was very much one of trying to find a level of acceptance as opposed to locking right into what I wanted to do with my life. This is another thing that's very common with neurodivergent people that are undiagnosed quite young, is the negative feedback that you get is very, very forthcoming, right? It's almost daily. And you become very attuned to that level of feedback. And so it becomes this inner drive to prove everyone wrong or to prove that status quo wrong, that you could actually outdo the feedback that you were given. And that can be a positive and a negative, right? It creates a big drive, but it can also have you pursue things in your life that aren't necessarily honest with yourself, with your true self. It definitely satisfies that outer shell that needs that positive feedback and reinforcement, but seldom is it ever doing the right thing for you, where you're thinking, well, I'm making my decisions based on my true self. So at this stage of my life, I'm definitely trying to lean more into making sure the decisions I make aren't for a level of validation from the world and more aligned into what is it that I want to actually be doing with the time that I've got.
This is a big statement. But would it be fair to say that you felt like you were successful in a career, but maybe not successful as yourself? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's 100% fair. Because we lose our identity of self. This is another thing, that's common amongst neurodivergent communities, is the sense of self becomes blurred. Because as a child, being your true self is often met with a level of negative feedback. whether that negative feedback is intended to be negative or not, it's normally always addressing the negative as opposed to empowering the positive. So yeah, I think you almost end up with, I'm not going to say a dual personality, but you end up with this like diffraction of your inner self, where you know there's this version that you have to sort of almost curate to fit into the world, right? To not be the weirdo, to not be the one that says the weird things or has the weird facial expressions. And so there's that version that is the worldly version. And then when you come home, you know, you do this thing, you take the mask off, you de-mask, and then you can sort of, if you're lucky, over the weekend, relax into yourself. And then come Sunday night, you sort of got the mask back out and given that a polish because we've got to go back to the real world this week and we can't necessarily be our real self. I think that's a definite point of awakening for people that are diagnosed neurodivergent later in life, is getting back to the true sense of self and trying to sort of de-mask those layers of what is authentically me versus what is the me that I'm putting on to fit into the world. So that's definitely some work I've been doing over the past little while.
Can you tell me a little bit about, obviously you were around 40 when you were diagnosed.
43 when I was diagnosed.
What's the process of reflection that you've been through once finding out that you've been diagnosed with
AuDHD? Yeah, AuDHD it's called. It's that beautiful combination of both autism and ADHD.
There's obviously a period of self-reflection that happens after that. Walk me through what that diagnosis revealed to you and how that's changed the trajectory of your professional career since.
Yep. I think personally, it definitely becomes this thing where you now have no choice but to start to know the real you. Because inevitably when you're undiagnosed, and I found this personally, when you're undiagnosed, you just can't help but wonder why the world is so hard, right? Why is everything so hard? Why does everything seem like it's so easy for other people to do? But for me, everything is a challenge, right? It's the challenge in ramping up for the task. It's the challenge in doing the task. And then it's finishing the task and having to await feedback from the work. Where is it going to go wrong? Is the feedback going to be good or bad? What am I going to do when I get the feedback? And you end up in this place where you have to let go of a lot of that thought process. And I'm fortunate enough to have an amazing psychologist that I've been working with for a while. And her point of view is to always frame it in that sense that you touched on before, where if that 7-year-old kid was here with you now, how would you, as the older brother, be delivering, you know, this information to this child, right? Would you be saying there's something wrong with you and you're not like other people? Or would you be encouraging this 7-year-old child to lean more into your alternative way of thinking, regardless of the negative feedback that comes your way, right? Because I sort of got to the point where I understood the negative feedback as being a misunderstanding, right? It's someone who doesn't know better critiquing you based on their set of views that they uphold as normal to the world. So personally, you have to be a bit kinder to yourself and you have to give yourself a little bit of grace that you sort of didn't know what was going on. I equate it to, it's like being a Windows user, but only ever having a manual to understand how to drive Mac OS. And then all of a sudden, the Windows manual rocks up and you're like, this is how wrong I've got it the whole time because I've just not been playing to my strengths. So there's a lot of that, you know, that comes from just being gentle to your ability to learn more about yourself and to actually enjoy some of the process too. Like finally being like, cool. I can actually sit with this characteristic of myself now that I know it's part of me, as opposed to thinking it's something I need to remedy or fix in order to remove. Sort of how I'd explain it.
So for those who don't understand, can you just walk me through how the autism and the ADHD sort of two sides of your brain work together? And then I'd like you to reflect, as a leader that you have been, how maybe you would accommodate for yourself in hindsight.
Yeah, well, I'll be straight up to say that those two parts of the brain don't work well together, right? Like the AuDHD thing is this really strange dichotomy of the elements of ADHD which, involve things like rejection sensitivity, a little bit of obsessive compulsive, always wanting to be a perfectionist, always being highly analytical, and masking in such a way that you can be social, that you're able to socially connect with people. And then there's the autistic part of your brain that doesn't really want any of that, right? It doesn't want the social connection. It doesn't want the responsibility. It doesn't want the accountability consistently. And it sort of wants to just exist as the moments come. So you need to sort of learn to squash a lot of that autistic stuff down. And the ADHD traits tend to almost come to the front because ADHD is very much more a survival response in that we can survive situations very well when our ADHD is leading, because again, it's pushing the authentic self to the back. And so I found that being treated for ADHD, because you can easily medicate for ADHD now, that sort of suppresses a lot of the ADHD negative traits, but it also suppresses some of the coping mechanism that comes with ADHD. And now the autism is on full show, right? The autism is almost the thing that leads once the ADHD starts to become treated. And because you've not been intimate with your autistic self for so many years, because ADHD has been leading, there's that element of then becoming used to your autistic traits and having to let them exemplify, right? They have to sort of be able to flourish now. And so you need to tune up things like your social contact, hours that you're out and in public versus hours that you're at home. I gave up drinking as a result of my diagnosis because, again, there's enough things trying to play havoc with my brain. I don't need to bring other substances into the mix. And I think that's sort of where that dichotomy comes from. It's trying to find the balance now between wanting perfection and wanting acceptance versus also not really being interested in social cohesion or interaction and being pretty happy to sort of do things my own way as I see fit, which doesn't really fit a corporate mold. So as a leader, where that becomes really tough is you want to be there for your people, particularly as a people manager, you want to be there for your people. But again, we have this really interesting relationship with empathy and sympathy. We can be very empathetic individuals, but we're rather clinically empathetic, right? Like it's delivered in a way that I get it, I've been through it, I recognize the pattern. Now, what are we going to do to move beyond it? As opposed to just being able to sit there with someone that's going through something and go through it with them. I think it's very difficult for us to share in emotional grief or difficulty with others because we can't separate ourselves from the emotion, right? We end up absorbing that emotion, taking that on. That's how we reflect. And so that's always the challenge as a leader is trying to support your people, be there for your people and allow that to work in your favor, but not adopt it personally as if it's a problem that I now have to help solve. And that was probably one of the things that I always found the most challenging is to sort of toe that line between support and not overexhaustion myself.
That's very much a process that you've reached yourself in terms of managing your emotions and understanding how your brain operates.
Mm.
The thing that came to mind was that often in the workplace, I mean, rightly or wrongly, health is definitely a stigma. You don't really talk about health in the workplace, mental health especially.
Mm.
Do you think that, if you were going to go back and I don't know, maybe to the beginning of your career and you had this diagnosis, if you were to be able to present the facts that this is how my brain works, do you think that that would be beneficial for someone like yourself, or would you rather that that wasn't a norm?
I think if I knew what I know now and had the option to put it on the table back then, I don't think the world would have been ready for it, right? The biggest stigma that came with neurodivergence as my years as a teen, not that I knew, but ADHD was always this thing of like you're a special needs kid, right? It was like you needed learning support and all that sort of stuff. And in school, you would not want to be diagnosed ADHD because then you're out of the norm. You're literally something else. Now I think there's more opportunity for it, but I think a lot of leaders, particularly leaders that have been in their leadership position for, decades now, or that have started businesses themselves, they got to be careful in understanding that the workforce itself is changing, right? We are having people now that are more and more focused on what does my work-life balance look like? Even before conversations of salary or before conversations of title or longevity, these people are like, is this place going to be healthy for me? What do you do to support mental health in the business? How do you manage alternative ways of thinking? What happens on days when mentally I can't show up? Am I going to be able to work from home? Is that going to be a problem? Is that going to be something we need to deal with? So I feel like the corporate world itself is about to have change thrust upon it if it's not already ready for that change, because this is the new language that people are coming to the workforce with, particularly if they're neurodivergent, because now the youth are empowered significantly more than we were when we were kids. And I think that youth now enters the workforce saying, well, I am going to be my authentic self. Am I allowed to be my authentic self? Because if I'm not going to be working here.
Because I suppose like something simple that I think when we're thinking about change and we're thinking about a younger generation coming in and asking these things at the workplace, it sounds like it's something big, but really for someone like yourself, I'm interested. Is something just like having the autonomy to take yourself off into your own space and work for a couple of hours, the kind of things that need to happen from leadership just to make things easier?
Yeah. The flexibility of work, and this is where I sort of made that point earlier about what are we measuring as productivity. The nature of a neurodivergent brain is that it was just never meant to function between 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. In a, post-agricultural society way of working. It's why we always struggled so much at school. It's why we're always diagnosed as being difficult learners, because we don't fit into that framework, right? Sometimes our brains are on, sometimes our brains are off. We're not in charge of that. It's the sort of thing where even feedback that I'd received over years in my career was, well, it's up to you how you show up. When you're getting negative feedback, the conversation is it's up to you how you show up. To the point where even that could extend sometimes to a conversation that was like, well, you're a leader and you're neurodivergent, so you need to take the action to show up positively so you can positively affect other neurodivergent employees. And like, that sounds a bit backwards. The reason I can't show up the way that is expected at the times expected is because of my neurodivergence. So not only do I need to work against that, but now I need to get all the other neurodivergent people to work against that. We will work when our brains are ready to work. And the other thing that becomes evident with that is it's almost a parody to us, the length of time that it can take a neurotypical person to complete a task. Like, I would imagine myself in my old roles going to my office and thinking, how am I going to sit in front of this computer for 8 hours of the day and look busy? Because the reality is I'm going to finish everything that's on the plate to be done in 2 hours. And then I'm going to be looking around the room like, so can I go home, or do I have to sit here for 6 hours and wait for something else to pop up? So I think if a business wants to challenge their convention of what do we need to do to make this more approachable, is what does the standard frame of reference look like to you when you are building structures of work? Is it wrong for people to not work Monday to Friday, 9 to 5? Is it okay if staff work from 3 in the afternoon until 10 at night? And is it cool for staff to go home when they've finished all their work for the day, even if that means there's 6 hours left in the day? We're still measuring productivity and how much stuff you can do in 40 hours. Could probably do a week's worth of work in 10 hours and then sleep for the rest of the week. I would still be judged in being the lazy worker who is sleeping for 10 hours of the week.
I sort of feel the same way with my work in terms of you go through periods of procrastination, but if there's a deadline, there's no doubt in my mind that the deadline, I will meet the deadline. I sort of leave myself enough time to get that done. from my own perspective, if it's a task that I've not done before, I struggle with that. They're the things that I procrastinate over, even though once they're done, they could be the easiest things that I do. But if it's a repeated task, I can set my mind to it. It's like a switch. I can just set my mind to it and complete the task with almost flick myself into a flow state pretty simply. I suppose what I'm trying to get at is if we're not measuring productivity in a 40-hour work week, how do we redefine what productivity means?
Productivity is outcome-based. It's always been outcome-based. But the outcomes that society is set up around, particularly like the working week, is set up around the factory cycle, right? Where productivity was based on bulk output over time, right? It's you're employed under the condition of you must be present for 40 hours a week. The presence becomes the visibility checklist of, are you being productive? Can I see you at your desk? Like you talk about salespeople. Can I see your call log? How many calls have you made? Because that's like how I'm going to measure your productivity. No, the productivity is measured on how many sales did I get. Regardless if I worked 40 hours a week or 3 hours a week, if I hit the sales target, then the objective is complete. That same thing applies to just about anything that you want to have in a workforce, of course, other than jobs where you need to be tactile and present, right? In the AV industry, if you're an installer, you obviously need to be installing or you can't do your job. But for the people that aren't, for the people that are working in design and those sorts of things, we've got to start measuring people on what is it I need you to produce and when do I need to have it produced? How you produce it, the time it takes you, the hours that you use, all of that stuff, totally up to you. I just want to see the outcome. But we're in this weird space at the moment where people are phrasing that as, oh, we're outcome based. We only measure the outcomes. We don't care how you get there. Until you work from home 3 days a week and they're like, why aren't you in the office? You need to be in the office. We need to see you in the office. Why? Because that's the standard. What standard? Well, that's the standard of this workplace. Okay, that sounds like a factory. Like I need to be here at the conveyor belt for 8 hours to prove that I'm actually doing what needs to be done. Just look at what I've delivered. That's what you wanted. That's been delivered. I think if we can get to a little bit more of that way of thinking, we will then start remeasuring productivity as actually being, productivity is actually okay. We've just been looking at it the wrong way. Been looking at it through a different lens.
I feel like the time factor as well, when you think about outcomes, when an outcome-based project, the thing that's always underestimated is how long something's going to take, to the point that, the average sales tenure is less than 18 months because they're put under so much pressure to get something done with project, like in the AV industry, with project timelines that could exceed to 3, 4, 5 years. How can you expect someone to be effective in their job if you're reducing that timeline to get a deal done that was never going to happen within that time frame? Speaking with people who are neurodiverse can see that problem clearly. Neurotypical norms or whatever managers tend to see things very differently there's a disconnect between reality and what's actually happening on the ground. I'm trying to frame a question
I can make
here,
a point in the sense of like with what you seem to be framing, I could relate to in the sense of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. This is a thing. And there's something that I can say that I saw very clearly in the AV industry was the short turnover of sales staff. Yeah. So people come on, they got 12 months to prove themselves. They don't prove themselves, they're gone. Right. That's very common in a lot of cottage industries, right? We can't afford to have a big sales team that we're supporting for any length of time. If they're not delivering, they've got to go. But the sales cycle, particularly on the big end of town, in some projects, dude, it's 2-3 years. Most technology upgrades, big tech upgrades, they're happening once every 5 to 7 years. If you talk about universities and those sorts of things. So you can't be putting that sole metric on someone and then being surprised when you've got high turnover of staff, because they're just not going to fit that mold. But I think the one gift that neurodivergent staff have, particularly as leaders, is this ability to recognize patterns, right? Our pattern recognition is one of the things that I think is our strongest skills, and quite often the thing that we are not empowered to use in a business environment, because we spot things that are going to go wrong well before they're going to go wrong. Yeah. We're good at threat detection and scanning the environment, and no one likes Mr. Negative. It just so happens that if someone's got an idea that is going to be crap, the neurodivergent person will go, that's a crap idea, and here's the 3 reasons why. And the feedback will be, that's negative. You're being judgmental. You're being dismissive. You're not giving them a chance. Well, the 12 months will go by, and then that person will be on their way because they didn't hit the targets. But then there'll be no credit that comes back to the neurodivergent person that called that out, that was being Mr. Negative and that was being wrong. So I don't think we need to blur the lines between, giving people a chance and not giving them a chance. But I think what we need to do is understand that the gifts that come from these neurodivergent ways of thinking are things that are not familiar to the neurotypical mind. So they might come across as dismissive or blunt or rude or judgmental. But if they later play off as being correct, let's learn from that. And then let's change the framework of understanding that you've got someone on your team who is a radar, and they are honest, and they're not going to sugarcoat things. If you want things filtered, you act as the filter. But don't expect the neurodivergent person to, particularly as they become more connected to their neurodivergence, don't expect them to turn their back on who they are so that we can fit this mold of professionalism. The professionalism conversation of everyone wants it, no one can explain what it is. So I feel like, again, we just have to change our one size fits all plus accommodations off to the side, and look at a way that we can start to rebuild our take on what work looks like in modern times.
In a previous episode of the podcast, I was interviewing a guy called Christopher Sellers, and he was talking about innovation in the workplace. He was talking about it from the perspective of creativity. But a lot of the themes are quite similar in this discussion. One of them being that for a creative, the solution to a problem could be immediate and simple. It's right there in front of you. It doesn't take 2 weeks of trying to think about it and nut it out. You could have a meeting and 30 minutes later come back with the solution. And I feel like, again, maybe coming back to that productivity thing, people think that things need to take time to come to the correct answer, rather than just having that person whose brain works in that way to be able to see everything laid out in front of them and going, this is the path forward. And I feel like maybe, and this podcast is about creativity as well, but sometimes the easiest way is just to see a path and recognize that the first step is what's going to take to progress an idea to the next stage. And if you can identify that first step and just move in a direction, then the solution will unfold in front of you. I'm wondering if you've had similar experiences or been frustrated by similar experiences where you can see it all in front of you, but been unable to convince anybody to come with you.
Like I tell you, that's that is the undertone of the neurodivergent employee, particularly one that is in a leadership environment. And meetings are the prime example. Like in my career, I remember sitting in on management meetings. There's always management meetings in the corporate world, of course, and you need them. You need to sort of get a team touching base and understanding what's happening. But 3 hours, like 3 hours in sitting in a meeting, we're really like, we could just rattle off all of the things that have been done, need doing, or are problems. Are any of these relevant to anyone in the room? Nah, cool, I'm going. I'm leaving this meeting. You guys can stay here for another 3 hours, but I have done my bit and I need no more of this information. Oh, you're not showing respect for your other team members by leaving. No. I'm showing them the utmost respect by not sitting in front of them and pretending like I'm interested. That is the other alternative point of view that the neurodivergent brain is now challenging. It's like, don't make me endure. Yeah, don't make me endure these things for the sake of lip service or visual presence. Yeah, explain to the team that the way we have meetings in this organization is if you cannot contribute successfully or you have nothing to take from the conversation, you are permitted to leave. All right, and you can exit the meeting and then you can look at the notes when the meeting is finished. But to have to sit in a meeting and wait 2 hours so that you can have your 15-minute bit and then sit through another hour of everyone else's bit, this is the sort of stuff where we're saying we're doing things the wrong way. We need to be aware of, as your point was earlier, a neurodivergent person will look at something from an element of pattern recognition and from a very macro lens, right? We are, in one hand, very macro until we're in a state of hyperfocus, and then we turn very micro. But the generic macro view that we have on everything, we tend to see things very all-encompassing, which is why our pattern recognition kicks in so often. But then when we express what we recognize in the pattern, if it's got a negative connotation, well, he's being negative again. He's just doing the thing that he always does, which is point out the negative. Let's champion alternative ways of thinking and let people best accommodate the needs of their brain.
As we're having this conversation, I'm like, oh, there's so many things that I relate to, but I have
Might
not.
be time to go and see the doctor, buddy.
What do you think? Do you think there is a relationship between neurodivergency and creativity if we're just putting the two concepts next to each other?
100%. 100%. Particularly when you look at, so if you look at autism, and I'm level 1 autism, right, which is, it was the old school Asperger's syndrome, right, which was then diagnosed and moved into the umbrella of autism. But if you look at people that are heavily afflicted by autism, right, particularly people that are nonverbal, their ability to create is the thing that they become, right? Because they are unable to express their inner thoughts and feelings through verbal communication. Sometimes the inability for them to create will then lead to a level of frustration that turns into an outburst or turns into what is visually perceived as aggression. But it is this ability to create that is almost unbridled by conventional ways of thinking, that the ability to create is then also viewed as this thing where it's like, oh, that's too much of a change. That's too different. Like, we can't go down that path, particularly when you're creating different approaches to management or different approaches to work or anything that is measurable in the fabric. It's often too jarring for people. It's too much of a change. It's too radical. Well, let's try it. Let's move into that space. Let's trust this alternative way of thinking that is always based on fact and evidence. Because there's one thing I can tell you with 100% certainty. A neurodivergent individual never puts forth their idea in a public sphere unless they have exhausted almost every opportunity that they could find to test that theory. Because we never want to be embarrassed. We never want to embarrass ourselves. We never want to make a fool of ourselves. We never want to stand out as being rejected. So if a neurodivergent individual is coming to you with an idea, that idea has been pressure tested to the nth degree. And the only thing left now is to try it in the real world. So I do believe that we're probably not doing enough in platforming that level of creativity, particularly for minds that are wired that way. Because again, we're worried it's not going to fit in, in the factory worker model. And I think that's due for a shakeup.
How do you think AI is enabling these kind of minds?
I agree with this philosophy. Most people that are in the AI sphere that are looking at how things are going to change over the next little while are pretty confident in saying that the neurodivergent mind is going to have a renaissance on the back of AI. Because our biggest problem is executive function, which apparently you need if you're going to be an executive, right? You've got to have some level of executive function, which is a thing that we naturally lack. The ability to disseminate the overwhelming abundance of new ideas that we have, right? That our minds are sometimes creating that much new content that often that for us to be able to disseminate that down into something that is presentable is a challenge. And our ability to, with that macro lens, step back from a list of tasks that need doing and prioritize them, or even outsource some of them to an AI. This is where I think the neurodivergent mind is going to have its renaissance, as I was saying, because now we have tools at our disposal that are managing the parts of our thought process that we can't manage all that well. And I feel like, particularly when you look at the AI entrepreneur sphere, people that are now stepping back from the corporate world because they have the tools where they can actually build their own thing. I think this will be something to keep an eye on over the next 4 or 5 years, right? As we're going to see this explosion of neurodivergent people that could never fit the factory worker mold, but now have all the tools at their disposal that they needed in order to be successful in the corporate sphere. They are not people anymore, right? They are robots. Robots are happy to be spoken to like robots. Humans aren't. And we tend to speak to people like they're robots because, again, our brain is, what is the task? How do I communicate the task that needs doing? Let's get on with the task. AI is like, cool, I'm on board with that. A human's like, I need to know why, I need to know when, I got to understand the drive behind it. How's it going to fit into my day? So we are going to find a level of success, I think, with the emergence of AI, particularly if businesses are happy to marry the two, right? Get your neurodivergent individuals championing the process of AI inclusion in the business. It's going to work out well for you.
So coming to the end of the podcast, we've just briefly touched on the two ideas of the neurodivergent mind and creativity. I'm wondering, what's your definition of creativity?
Yeah, much time I spent thinking about this question. It's such a hard thing to put into perspective. And so the best I could come down to is, if I'm defining what creativity is for me, it's the ability to bring into the physical world the dilution of all of the most ecstatic thoughts that I've had in the metacognitive world, right? It's my ability to disseminate something from all of the nonsense and bring it into the physical world that then has a purpose, right? I don't really care what the purpose is. If I build something at home because I'm, doing a renovation task, as long as it serves the purpose, it's a success for me. If I'm at work and I deliver a new process that helps other people get things done in a particular way, that's the purpose for me. So I think it's the materialization of the metacognitive into something that can then serve a purpose in the real world.
That's an awesome answer, mate. Well, thanks for joining us on the Creative Business Podcast, Myke. For everybody out there, if you've enjoyed the conversation, you can help us grow by making sure you subscribe to the channel. But until next time, stay creative. Thanks, Myke.